The entire Western world is completely and utterly distracted right now, staring anxiously at the Middle East and waiting in absolute terror for the next massive military strike to completely paralyze the global energy markets. But while the United States government and the American public are entirely focused on a devastating, multi-trillion-dollar oil war in the Persian Gulf, China is quietly executing the single greatest physical resource heist in human history. We just received the absolute latest, breaking customs data directly out of Asia this morning, and the physical numbers we are looking at are so incredibly massive that they completely break the fundamental mathematics of the global supply chain. According to these newly released official import reports, Chinese buyers just violently vacuumed up a staggering all-time record of 836 tons of physical silver in the month of March alone. Think about the sheer, terrifying physical logistics of what 836 tons of silver actually looks like. Because we're absolutely not talking about digital spreadsheets or empty paper trading contracts sitting on a computer screen in New York. We are talking about massive, heavily armored transport planes and giant commercial cargo ships physically moving thousands upon thousands of solid, 1,000-ounce industrial silver bars directly out of Western vaults and permanently relocating them into the mainland of China. And when you actually zoom out and look at the terrifying trajectory of this massive physical drain over the entire first quarter of 2026, the mathematical reality of this supply squeeze becomes absolutely undeniable and totally catastrophic for the Western manufacturing sector. Because in just the first 3 months of this year, the Chinese economy has aggressively imported an estimated 1,600 tons of physical silver, actively consuming the global supply at a completely unprecedented breakneck pace that no other nation on Earth can even attempt to match. To put that catastrophic level of physical consumption into its proper, terrifying perspective, you have to compare those massive import figures directly against the total amount of new silver that the global mining industry can physically pull out of the earth in a given year. With the reported global annual production sitting at roughly 2,500 tons, the fact that China just swallowed 1,600 tons in a single quarter means they are literally consuming the vast majority of the entire planet's yearly mining supply before the West even realizes what is happening. This means that every other massive industrial nation on the planet, including the United States, Europe, and Japan, is currently being forced to violently fight over the tiny, rapidly shrinking fraction of physical silver that China has not already locked away behind their own borders. And you really have to stop and ask yourself why the Chinese government is suddenly allowing this massive, historic tidal wave of physical silver to flow directly into their domestic vaults at the exact same time the rest of the world is distracted by a massive energy war in the Persian Gulf. You have to remember that back in December, the Chinese government quietly but deliberately elevated the status of silver, officially declaring it a critical strategic metal for their national security and their domestic manufacturing survival. When a massive global superpower like China officially designates a physical commodity as a strategic national asset, it is an incredibly loud, undeniable signal to the entire global intelligence community that they are aggressively preparing for a massive, prolonged physical supply chain war. It strongly suggests that the actual, tangible amount of physical silver flowing into China right now is likely significantly higher than what the official customs data is publicly reporting. Because strategic metal acquisitions are historically hoarded entirely off the books to prevent the Western world from understanding the true depth of the shortage. The Chinese leadership is looking completely past the daily, heavily manipulated spot prices quoted on Western television screens, and they are making a highly calculated, aggressive geopolitical bet that whoever physically holds the actual industrial metals will ultimately dictate the survival of the modern global economy. Because while American politicians are desperately bickering over temporary ceasefires and trying to artificially suppress the physical price of commodities to save the purchasing power of their own domestic currency, the physical reality is that the modern world simply cannot function without an abundant, continuous supply of real silver. Every single advanced military guidance system, every piece of modern medical equipment, the vast majority of the highly sensitive electronics required to run the American technology sector are absolutely 100% dependent on the physical conductive properties of this specific metal. And instead of securing this absolutely vital resource for their own domestic manufacturing base, the United States is standing by and watching idly as millions upon millions of physical ounces are systematically loaded onto cargo ships and sent halfway across the globe to their biggest geopolitical rival. It is the ultimate catastrophic failure of Western supply chain management, completely exposing the terrifying vulnerability of an American economy that has spent the last 2 decades prioritizing digital illusions of wealth while completely outsourcing the physical extraction and refining of its most critical raw materials. We are witnessing a massive, irreversible east-to-west divergence unfold in real time, where the Western financial centers continue to push around empty paper contracts, completely oblivious to the fact that the underlying physical assets required to back up those contracts are being aggressively drained by the East. You have to look at the broader macroeconomic picture here, because China is effectively using the chaos in the Middle East as the ultimate geopolitical smokescreen to secure the foundational building blocks of the 21st century, while everyone else is looking the other way. By the time the United States finally manages to temporarily stabilize the Strait of Hormuz and get the physical crude oil flowing again, they are going to turn around and realize that their own defense contractors and technology giants cannot source the materials needed to actually build anything. This is not some speculative theory about what might happen 10 years from now. This is a verifiable, mathematically proven supply crisis happening right this very second, confirmed by the hardest possible data coming straight out of the global customs offices. The physical wealth of the world is being violently and permanently transferred out of Western vaults and into Eastern warehouses, setting the stage for a completely unprecedented industrial bottleneck that is going to aggressively rewrite the balance of global power. Think about it this way. If you were trying to completely corner the global market on the most critical technology metal in existence, you would want the rest of the world completely fixated on a massive, terrifying distraction just like the one currently unfolding in the Persian Gulf. And honestly, the sheer scale of this 1,600-ton physical silver drain proves that this is a highly coordinated, incredibly deliberate strategy to completely strip the Western world of its industrial capacity before they ever have a chance to react and secure their own borders. And the absolute most terrifying part of this entire situation is that the massive Chinese industrial machine currently vacuuming up all of this physical silver is not showing a single sign of slowing down anytime soon, because their massive domestic demand is absolutely not based on temporary financial trends or speculative paper trading algorithms, but is instead being driven by fundamental, unstoppable physical forces that absolutely cannot be turned off or negotiated away by Western politicians. Here's the thing. You first have to look at the completely terrified Chinese retail investor base that is desperately scrambling to protect their personal wealth from the massive waves of global economic instability and the terrifying inflation rippling across the world. Everyday citizens over in the Eastern Hemisphere are completely bypassing the traditional banking systems and the highly manipulated stock markets, choosing instead to aggressively hoard physical silver coins and solid bars at a pace that the global markets have absolutely never seen before. Real talk. When an entire population completely loses faith in the long-term purchasing power of their own fiat currency and begins aggressively converting their life savings directly into tangible physical metals, it creates a massive, unrelenting baseline of physical demand. This continuous panicked retail buying spree is systematically draining the available physical supply right out of the local markets, creating an incredibly tight foundation of scarcity before the massive, heavy industrial buyers even step up to the table to place their massive wholesale orders. But honestly, the sheer scale of the retail panic is genuinely just a tiny fraction of the overarching problem, because the absolute primary driver of this historic 1,600-ton supply squeeze is the sheer, unstoppable momentum of the Chinese domestic solar energy industry. Think about it this way. Over the last decade, China has systematically and deliberately positioned itself as the undisputed absolute global leader in the manufacturing of high-efficiency photovoltaic solar panels, aggressively monopolizing the entire green energy supply chain from top to bottom. And every single one of those millions of high-efficiency solar panels currently rolling off their massive state-of-the-art assembly lines requires a massive, non-negotiable amount of highly refined physical silver paste just to properly conduct electricity and function at a commercial level. They are aggressively building out massive, nationwide green energy infrastructure projects internally, while simultaneously flooding the global export markets with their discounted solar technology, ensuring that their industrial appetite for physical silver is essentially infinite and completely insatiable. It completely does not matter what the Western spot price happens to be flashing on a given Tuesday morning in New York, because the Chinese manufacturing sector is mathematically forced to continue buying and hoarding every single physical ounce of silver they can get their hands on just to meet their massive production quotas. And you absolutely cannot substitute silver out of these advanced solar panels and just replace it with a cheaper, more abundant metal like copper without massively degrading the physical efficiency and drastically shortening the overall lifespan of the entire energy grid. The unique, unparalleled physical conductivity of silver makes it an absolute irreplaceable necessity in modern engineering. completely trapping the entire global technology sector in a terrifying scenario where their most critical ingredient is rapidly vanishing into the heavily guarded vaults of a single geopolitical superpower. And here is the absolute most terrifying part for the everyday American taxpayer and the massive Western industrial base, who are completely unaware of this massive supply chain collapse unfolding right underneath their noses while they watch the news about the Middle East. When a single nation is physically importing over 60% of the entire global annual mining supply in just 3 short months, it mathematically guarantees a massive, violent physical shortage for every other manufacturing powerhouse left operating in the West. We are rapidly approaching a catastrophic inflection point where massive American technology companies, electric vehicle manufacturers, and critical defense contractors are going to wake up one morning and desperately try to source the physical silver required to fulfill their massive government contracts. They are going to confidently place their massive wholesale industrial orders, expecting the physical metal to be readily available for immediate delivery, only to suddenly realize that the Western commodity vaults are completely empty and the foundational supply chain has entirely broken down, because for years, the massive global commodities markets operated on the incredibly dangerous, fundamental assumption that there would always be enough physical metal sitting quietly in London or New York to keep the Western industrial assembly lines running smoothly without any interruptions. But this unprecedented record-breaking Chinese vacuum has completely destroyed that comfortable illusion, proving once and for all that paper contracts and digital spreadsheets absolutely cannot build advanced solar panels or guide military defense systems if the actual physical metal is completely gone. The entire global silver market has officially and undeniably entered a massive, multi-year structural tightness regime, which is an incredibly dangerous reality where the entire world is fundamentally consuming significantly more silver than the mining industry can actually pull out of the earth. We are officially looking at the 6th consecutive year of massive global structural deficits in the silver market, with the physical shortfall projected to violently widen by another 15% this year alone to reach an estimated staggering 46 million troy ounces. And to truly comprehend the sheer, staggering magnitude of this industrial supply crisis, you have to realize that since the beginning of 2021, an unimaginable 762 million physical ounces of silver have been completely depleted and wiped out from global inventories. That is nearly 1 billion ounces of physical wealth that has completely evaporated from the global stockpiles, burned up in massive industrial factories, and permanently locked away in private retail vaults, leaving the current physical market completely starved for fresh liquidity. And you cannot simply throw billions of dollars at the global mining companies and order them to dramatically increase their silver production to solve this massive shortage overnight, because the fundamental geology of how silver is extracted makes that absolutely impossible. Roughly 70% of all the new silver introduced into the global market is mined strictly as a byproduct of extracting base metals like copper, lead, and zinc, meaning that silver is essentially just a secondary accidental bonus for the massive global mining conglomerates. You cannot simply flip a switch and open a dedicated new silver mine to rapidly flood the market with fresh supply, which means the global supply cap is effectively frozen in place while the Chinese industrial demand aggressively skyrockets to unimaginable new heights. So we are staring straight down the barrel of a multi-year, mathematically guaranteed physical deficit, where the total inventory of available silver steadily declines month after month, with absolutely no return to equilibrium or price stability anywhere in sight. This massive, unstoppable structural bottleneck leaves the Western world completely exposed to the most violent supply shock in modern history, operating highly advanced manufacturing sectors with absolutely no secure pipeline for the exact raw material required to keep the lights on and the factories running. This is exactly what an actual physical supply squeeze looks like in the real world, completely devoid of any internet hype, Wall Street speculation, or highly manipulated paper market trading algorithms designed to suppress the price. It is driven entirely by the brutal, undeniable reality that the modern world is rapidly running out of the most critical industrial metal on Earth, and China has aggressively decided to take whatever physical inventory is left, while the West is entirely distracted by foreign wars. And the massive psychological impact of this structural deficit is finally starting to crack the confidence of the major Western financial institutions, who are quietly realizing that the physical buffer they relied on for decades to suppress the price is officially gone. Think about the absolute panic inside the massive bullion banks right now, watching an estimated 213 million physical ounces aggressively flow out of Western jurisdictions and move directly over to London and China just to satisfy this unrelenting industrial demand. The massive, critical 1,000-ounce physical bars that are the absolute lifeblood of the wholesale manufacturing market are becoming so incredibly scarce that we are watching a massive, panicked migration of physical assets that completely bypasses the traditional Western pricing mechanisms. We are literally watching a modern-day bank run on the global physical commodities exchanges, where the smartest, most well-capitalized Eastern manufacturing giants are aggressively converting their unbacked fiat currency into the tangible physical assets required to dominate the next century of technological innovation. And honestly, the United States is entirely powerless to stop this massive wealth transfer from happening, because the administration is currently dedicating all of its political capital and military resources toward fighting a massive, unwinnable energy conflict in the Strait of Hormuz. While Washington is desperately trying to engineer 24-hour ultimatums to stop physical crude oil from spiking past $90 a barrel, Beijing is quietly and systematically securing the absolute foundational building blocks required to completely control the future of the global economy. The American economy has spent the last 20 years completely financializing its entire existence, prioritizing digital banking, software development, and speculative trading, while entirely outsourcing the messy, physical reality of mining and manufacturing to the Eastern Hemisphere. And now that catastrophic strategic miscalculation is finally coming home to roost in the most devastating way possible, as the United States suddenly realizes that you cannot print physical silver out of thin air to build your advanced fighter jets or your domestic power grid. This massive 836-ton import record from March is not just a random statistical anomaly on a spreadsheet. It is a glaring, massive siren warning the Western world that the era of cheap, abundant physical commodities is officially over. We are entering a completely new, terrifying paradigm where the actual physical possession of critical raw materials is the only thing that dictates true geopolitical power. And right now, China is holding all the winning cards while the West holds completely empty paper contracts. And the absolute most terrifying consequence of this historic, massive Chinese supply vacuum is that it has fundamentally and violently fractured the entire global pricing mechanism for physical commodities, completely exposing the massive illusion of the Western markets. Because when one single nation decides to aggressively hoard over 60% of the entire world's newly mined silver supply in a single quarter, the actual physical price of that critical industrial metal completely detaches from the suppressed numbers you see flashing on American financial networks. Right now, while the Western spot price desperately clings to that $80 level and American investors are repeatedly told the supply chain is perfectly stable, the massive industrial buyers over on the Shanghai exchange are actively and happily paying over $90.54 for actual tangible delivery. We are literally watching an absolutely staggering $10.77 physical premium form in the Eastern markets, meaning that buyers in China are perfectly willing to pay a massive, unprecedented surcharge just to guarantee that the actual metal physically arrives at their manufacturing facilities. You really have to understand the brutal, undeniable economic logic of a massive physical premium like that, because if you are a major global silver supplier holding massive amounts of physical inventory, you're absolutely not going to sell your metal into the suppressed Western market for $80 an ounce. You are going to immediately load every single available ounce you have onto a cargo ship and send it directly to Shanghai to capture that massive $90 payout, which aggressively accelerates the catastrophic draining of the Western vaults. And this massive, mathematically guaranteed global arbitrage is exactly why we are seeing breaking depository reports confirming that an estimated 213 million physical ounces have already forcefully flowed out of the United States and directly over to London and China. The massive critical 1,000-ounce physical bars that are absolutely required by heavy industrial manufacturers, electric vehicle producers, and global defense contractors are becoming so incredibly scarce in the Western world that institutions are desperately scrambling to locate available inventory just to keep the assembly lines from violently snapping. We are seeing the absolute daily destruction of the Western physical stockpiles, with the absolute latest vault data confirming that another 1.15 million physical ounces were just aggressively withdrawn from major institutions like JP Morgan and Loomis in a single 24-hour period. This is the exact definition of a massive physical bank run on the global commodities market, where the Eastern manufacturing heavyweights are aggressively converting their currency into the tangible, physical assets required to build out the technology infrastructure of the 21st century. When the massive American technology conglomerates and defense contractors finally wake up and realize they need to secure massive quantities of physical silver to meet their production quotas, they are going to look at the Western vaults and realize that the actual metal simply is not there anymore. Because for decades, the entire American manufacturing sector operated under the incredibly dangerous, completely false assumption that as long as the paper spot price was stable, there would always be an infinite amount of physical raw materials sitting in a warehouse ready for delivery. But China just aggressively proved that paper contracts absolutely do not matter when the physical supply chain is broken, and they are using their massive industrial demand to systematically gut the Western commodity exchanges and pull all the actual wealth over to the Eastern Hemisphere. This is exactly how a global superpower secures permanent dominance over the future of the global economy, not by fighting over digital numbers on a screen, but by aggressively cornering the market on the exact physical elements required to manufacture the advanced technology that runs the modern world. It is an incredibly terrifying wealth transfer that is happening completely in the open, yet the American public is entirely unaware of the massive supply chain collapse because their attention is being deliberately pulled halfway across the globe by an administration that is fighting a completely different kind of war. But while the physical wealth of the global economy is being violently transferred from the West to the East at an unprecedented pace, the United States government is entirely distracted by the terrifying, rapidly escalating military chaos currently exploding across the Middle East. Because while China is quietly executing the greatest physical resource heist in human history and permanently securing the global silver supply, the administration in Washington is completely consumed by a massive multi-trillion-dollar energy war that just took a catastrophic turn on the Monday morning open. After the White House desperately tried to manufacture a massive public victory on Friday by falsely claiming the Strait of Hormuz was secure and the war was over, the brutal physical reality of the conflict violently reasserted itself right as the global trading desks opened for the week. The global physical energy markets watched in absolute terror as physical crude oil aggressively spiked 8% right on the Monday open, violently surging directly back toward $90 a barrel and completely wiping out the brief artificial relief that the administration tried to sell to the American public over the weekend. And the specific catalyst for this massive Monday morning energy shock is an incredibly aggressive, completely unprecedented new ultimatum issued directly by the President of the United States, who just slammed a terrifying 24-hour ticking clock right onto the global negotiating table. The Commander-in-Chief has publicly and explicitly threatened that if a finalized ironclad deal is not reached with the Iranian government by tomorrow, the United States military will unleash a devastating wave of massive airstrikes designed to systematically destroy Iranian civilian and energy infrastructure. This isn't just a vague diplomatic warning that can be delayed or ignored. This is a massive, highly specific timeline that backs the entire United States military into a heavily armed corner, forcing Washington to either launch one of the most destructive bombing campaigns in modern history tomorrow or watch its global authority completely collapse. By actively threatening to destroy the foundational infrastructure of a massive regional power within 24 hours, the administration is practically guaranteeing that Iran will violently retaliate by completely shutting down whatever remaining commercial traffic is desperately trying to navigate the Persian Gulf. This massive geopolitical headfake and subsequent 24-hour military ultimatum is the ultimate catastrophic distraction for the United States, effectively blinding the administration to the massive industrial supply crisis detonating in the background while they desperately try to forcefully pry open the global flow of physical oil. Because you absolutely cannot sustain a massive open-ended military conflict halfway across the world when your own domestic manufacturing base is being systematically hollowed out by a massive Asian import vacuum and a total evaporation of the physical silver supply. The administration is actively fighting a desperate, incredibly expensive war to secure the cheap physical energy required to power the American economy, completely oblivious to the fact that the actual physical raw materials required to build the modern technology powered by that energy are being permanently drained by the East. And the terrifying reality for the everyday American taxpayer is that they are entirely trapped in the crossfire of this massive two-front global resource war, forced to absorb the devastating financial blowback at the gas pump today, while facing a catastrophic collapse of the technology supply chain tomorrow. When physical crude oil violently surges back to $90 a barrel because of a 24-hour military ultimatum, the cost of the physical diesel fuel required to transport basic groceries across the American highway system immediately skyrockets, directly accelerating the massive physical inflation that is already crushing the middle class. We are literally watching the perfect economic storm materialize in real time, where skyrocketing energy costs completely paralyze the domestic consumer, while massive multi-year structural deficits in critical industrial metals permanently cripple the foundational base of American manufacturing. So as we sit here anxiously watching the clock tick down toward tomorrow's massive military deadline in the Middle East, we have to realize that the true, lasting damage to the American economy is not just happening in the Strait of Hormuz, but inside the rapidly emptying physical vaults of the Western commodities exchanges. It is an absolutely chilling scenario where the greatest military superpower on Earth could find its own highly advanced supply chains completely paralyzed by an Asian manufacturing rival that quietly and systematically bought up all the physical inventory, while Washington was busy arguing over Middle Eastern borders. Think about it this way. If you are an executive at a major American defense firm trying to build the next generation of guided missiles, and you suddenly realize You cannot acquire the physical silver required for your targeting systems. Your entire multi-billion-dollar government contract is completely worthless. The entire foundation of Western industrial dominance was built on the assumption of cheap, readily available commodities. And now that the Eastern world is actively demanding physical delivery, that entire global supply chain architecture is completely crumbling right before our very eyes. The absolute irony of this entire situation is that the United States is actively threatening to blow up oil refineries in the Middle East to project global strength, while completely surrendering their actual technological and industrial independence to a foreign power without firing a single shot. Real talk. When the history books are written about this exact moment in time, they are not going to focus on a 24-hour military ultimatum or a temporary spike in crude oil. They are going to focus on the exact week that the Western world completely ran out of physical silver. The markets are trying to tell us exactly what is coming next, and when you see a $10 premium on a physical commodity in Shanghai, that is a massive blaring siren warning you that the system is fundamentally broken, and the actual physical supply is completely gone. Because the simple, undeniable math of the situation tells us that China cannot continue to import 60% of the global mining supply every single quarter without triggering an absolute catastrophic industrial default in the Western world that will completely shatter the modern domestic economy. I want to ask you a very serious, deeply uncomfortable question about the terrifying reality of the American economy right now, because we are currently standing on the very edge of a massive, completely irreversible industrial cliff, and no one is paying attention. If the entire foundational base of the United States military apparatus and the massive domestic technology sector completely relies on physical silver to function, what exactly happens to this country when the Western commodity vaults officially hit absolute zero? We are absolutely not talking about some abstract, highly complicated financial theory or a hypothetical worst-case scenario that might happen decades from now. We are talking about a brutal mathematical certainty that is unfolding right in front of our eyes this exact week. The Chinese government has systematically and undeniably proven that they are perfectly willing to pay whatever massive, unprecedented physical premium is required to guarantee that every single ounce of newly mined silver flows directly into their heavily guarded domestic shores. And the United States government is completely enabling this catastrophic global wealth transfer by keeping the entire domestic population entirely fixated on a completely unwinnable multi-trillion-dollar oil war in the Middle East that is completely draining the national treasury. Think about the sheer, terrifying absurdity of the geopolitical situation unfolding in Washington right now, as the administration actively threatens to bomb critical Iranian infrastructure just to project an illusion of absolute global dominance to the rest of the world. They are desperately trying to prove to the international community that the American military is still the ultimate unquestioned authority in global geopolitics, while quietly and systematically surrendering their entire technological manufacturing future to their biggest Asian rival without firing a shot. Real talk. You absolutely cannot fight a modern 21st century global war if you cannot physically manufacture the highly advanced missile guidance systems, the sophisticated radar arrays, and the massive satellite communication networks required to actually secure a military victory. And every single one of those critical high-tech defense systems requires a massive, continuous, completely uninterrupted supply of highly refined physical silver that is currently being loaded onto commercial cargo ships and sent directly across the ocean to the port of Shanghai. The administration is essentially trying to hold the entire global oil supply hostage with a massive 24-hour military ultimatum, completely oblivious to the terrifying reality that China already holds the entire Western technology and manufacturing sector completely hostage. It is the absolute ultimate geopolitical trap, and the United States walk directly into it with their eyes wide open, completely blinded by their own arrogant obsession with suppressing paper commodities just to artificially hide the massive domestic inflation from the voters. Because for the last 20 years, the massive financial institutions on Wall Street convinced the American government that actual tangible physical manufacturing simply didn't matter as long as the digital stock market indices kept magically hitting new all-time highs every single quarter. They built an entire domestic economy entirely based on sophisticated financial engineering, cloud-based software development, and the desperate printing of trillions of dollars of completely unbacked fiat currency to artificially pump up the absolute illusion of infinite, never-ending American wealth. But here's the thing. You cannot print physical commodities out of thin air no matter how hard you try. And you absolutely cannot force a global manufacturing powerhouse like China to accept your rapidly devaluing paper currency in exchange for their critical raw materials forever. That massive $10.77 physical premium currently breaking the Shanghai exchange is the ultimate undeniable proof that the Eastern world is officially and permanently rejecting the highly manipulated Western financial system that has controlled the global markets for decades. They are looking directly at the massive, completely unsustainable 7% budget deficit in the United States. They are looking at the skyrocketing inflation, violently crushing the American consumer. They are demanding actual, tangible physical delivery to protect themselves from the collapse. And the really terrifying part of this entire equation is that this massive east-to-west divergence is happening right as the global silver supply officially enters its 6th consecutive year of massive, completely unavoidable structural deficits that absolutely cannot be fixed. The entire global mining industry is already operating at their absolute maximum physical capacity, desperately trying to pull enough byproduct silver out of their massive copper and zinc mines just to keep the current heavily strained supply chains from violently snapping in half. There is absolutely no secret, massive underground reserve of physical silver waiting to be unlocked by Western mining companies to suddenly swoop in and save the American manufacturing base from this catastrophic, mathematically guaranteed industrial bottleneck. The metal simply does not exist anywhere else on the planet, which means the massive 1,600-ton import vacuum we just witnessed from China is quite literally draining the very last remaining drops of physical liquidity entirely out of the Western system. When that liquidity officially dries up, and the major American industrial conglomerates suddenly realize that the COMEX vaults in New York and the massive London depositories are completely empty, the resulting corporate panic is going to be unlike anything we have ever seen in modern history. We're going to watch massive multi-billion-dollar technology companies completely halt their domestic production lines, frantically bidding against each other just to secure a single 1,000-ounce industrial silver bar, just to keep the lights on and fulfill their government contracts. And the everyday American taxpayer is going to be the one who ultimately pays the absolute highest price for this catastrophic multi-decade failure of government foresight and the complete abandonment of strategic domestic supply chain management. Because while the domestic consumer is currently getting absolutely crushed by the 36% surge in basic vehicle ownership costs and the massive coordinated price hikes orchestrated at the local grocery store, the real economic pain hasn't even officially started yet. When the Western industrial sector officially breaks down because of this massive silver shortage, the physical cost of every single piece of modern technology, from your new smartphone to your highly efficient solar panels, is going to violently and permanently skyrocket out of reach. The administration is going to be forced to stand at a podium and try to explain to the American public exactly why they spent trillions of dollars fighting a massive naval blockade in the Middle East while completely ignoring the greatest resource heist in human history. They're going to have to desperately explain how they allowed a foreign manufacturing rival to quietly and systematically buy up over 60% of the entire global silver mining supply in a single quarter without ever raising a single red flag to the American people. And honestly, there is absolutely no sophisticated geopolitical spin or heavily engineered White House press briefing that can possibly justify, excuse, or hide the sheer, devastating mathematical reality of a completely empty physical commodities vault when the factories are forced to shut down. The massive global markets are currently suspended in a terrifying state of absolute paralyzed anticipation, waiting to see exactly how this massive 24-hour military ultimatum in the Persian Gulf is going to violently collide with the Asian physical supply squeeze. If the commander-in-chief actually follows through on his massive, unprecedented threat to systematically destroy Iranian infrastructure tomorrow morning, the resulting explosion in physical crude oil is going to act as a massive, uncontrollable accelerant for this entire global economic crisis. Skyrocketing physical energy costs will immediately and violently cripple the Western mining operations that are already desperately struggling to produce enough byproduct silver just to survive, completely destroying any remaining hope of a miraculous supply chain recovery. It is an absolutely perfectly executed, multi-decade geopolitical checkmate, where the United States is mathematically forced to destroy its own domestic economic stability just to maintain the incredibly fragile, rapidly fading illusion of absolute global military dominance. I really want to know exactly what you guys think about this massive, catastrophic collision between the Middle Eastern energy war and the Eastern physical metal squeeze, because we are literally watching the entire history of the global economy be rewritten right now. Do you actually believe the United States government has some secret, highly classified strategic stockpile of physical silver left to save the defense industry? Or are the Western vaults truly as dangerously empty as the massive Shanghai premium suggests? And what exactly do you think is going to happen to the American economy tomorrow morning when the clock officially runs out on this massive, terrifying 24-hour military ultimatum currently hanging over the Strait of Hormuz? Drop your absolute best, unfiltered predictions down in the comments below right now. because the next couple of days are guaranteed to be some of the most incredibly volatile and dangerous trading sessions we have ever witnessed in our entire lifetimes. Make sure you aggressively hit that subscribe button and turn on all of your notifications so you absolutely do not miss the massive, immediate fallout when the global markets finally react to this terrifying convergence of crises tomorrow morning. Keep an incredibly close eye on the physical price of crude oil and the massive premiums on the Shanghai Silver Exchange as this entire week develops. Stay extremely safe out there as this massive inflation wave continues to hit, and I will see you in the next breakdown.